They told me not to go into my old room, that it was just storage now, but something didn't feel right. The way my mother smiled too quickly, the way my father avoided eye contact. That night, when the house was quiet, I found the hidden key and opened the door. They swore was off limits. What I saw inside didn't just take my breath away. It shattered every memory I had of what love was supposed to look like. I didn't scream. I didn't confront them. I just stepped outside and called 911. Because betrayal from strangers is one thing, but from family, that breaks you. 3 years, that's how long it had been since I last walked through my parents' front door. The reason I came back wasn't sentimental. It wasn't for the holidays or a sudden burst of nostalgia. It was because Grandma was in the hospital again, and this time it felt different. Like a goodbye was approaching, slow and inevitable. The drive up to the house was familiar, but the feeling in my chest wasn't. My childhood home sat exactly as it always had: beige siding, white shutters, flower beds too perfectly trimmed. But as I stepped out of the car, there was no flutter of warmth, just silence, broken by the soft click of my suitcase wheels on the driveway. The front door opened before I even knocked. My mother stood there, hands folded neatly in front of her, wearing that polite smile she reserved for neighbors and store clerks. "You made good time," she said, stepping aside. No hug, no "I missed you," just that empty smile and the faint scent of lemon cleaner wafting from the hallway behind her. My father appeared from the living room, offering a nod. "Hey, kid," he said, like I'd just returned from a short walk, not 3 years of deliberate distance. His voice held no warmth, just casual acknowledgement, like I was a guest, a tenant. Inside, everything was spotless, too spotless. The floors gleamed, not a single picture frame was tilted, and the air felt scrubbed. I scanned the hallway automatically, eyes drawn to the staircase that led up to the room I once called mine. A quiet ache bloomed in my chest. "I'll just drop my bag in my room," I said halfway to the stairs before they even responded. My mother's voice cut through the air like a blade. "Don't go up there." I paused mid-step, turned. "Why not?" She exchanged a glance with my father, whose expression tensed for a split second. "It's not your room anymore," she said with a lightness that didn't match the words. "We're using it for storage now. Storage. A word that landed harder than it should have." My chest tightened, but I forced a nod. "Okay, where should I?" "The guest room," my father said quickly. "We made it up for you." "Right. Made it up? Like I was a visitor, like I hadn't spent 18 years in this house, like my name hadn't once been on the door upstairs in stickers I peeled off before college. I followed them down the hall, dragging my suitcase across the polished wood. The guest room used to be Dad's old office. They'd put a narrow bed in there, a single pillow, no photographs, no books. The walls were bare except for a generic canvas print of a tree. "This okay?" Mum asked. I gave her a tight smile. "It's fine." It wasn't. But I didn't argue. What was the point? The air was already thick with unspoken things. I could feel them pushing at the edges of the room, pressing against my ribs. There was so much I wanted to say, but none of it felt safe. None of it would be heard. Dinner that night was a quiet affair. We sat at the table like 3 actors running through an old script. They asked about my job. I gave clipped answers. They nodded in the right places. Laughed once, though I don't remember the joke. My father mentioned gas prices. My mother commented on a neighbour's new mailbox. Not a single question about the last 3 years. Not a single mention of Grandma until I brought it up. "She asked about you," I said, my fork idle on the plate. "She remembers the last concert." My mother glanced at my father, then down at her glass. "She's been confused lately." "She's not confused," I said, sharper than I meant. "She remembers plenty." Silence. They didn't argue. They didn't agree. They just moved on. That night, lying on the stiff mattress in the guest room, staring at the ceiling, I felt the old weight settle in, the one that had lived in my chest since high school, the one that whispered, "You don't belong here." It hadn't changed, not even after all this time. The next morning, I wandered the house with slow, silent steps, like I was tracing the edges of a dream that used to belong to someone else. Everything looked familiar, but it didn't feel like mine. Not anymore. The living room was spotless, pristine, the kind of clean that felt curated, like a showroom. The couch was new, sleek and grey, not the soft floral one we used to pile onto for movie nights. No more Afghan blanket that Grandma had crocheted when I was 10. No more mismatched cushions or that old coffee. Table with the chipped leg never fixed, all gone. And then I noticed the photos. Everywhere I looked, on the walls, on the shelves, above the fireplace, were framed pictures of Rebecca. Rebecca at her graduation, Rebecca in Florence on a gondola, Rebecca in a sharp navy pantsuit shaking someone's hand. Some of the photos were new, clearly taken within the past year. Others were older, but they all had one thing in common. I wasn't in any of them. I moved closer to a side table near the stairs. There had once been a framed photo of me and Grandma there. Me playing the piano, her smiling beside me. Now that frame was gone. In its place, a newer photo, Rebecca at some conference, holding a microphone like she owned the world. I kept walking, my throat dry, pulse ticking in my ears. Past the dining room, down the hallway. Even the hallway, once covered in our childhood art projects, goofy family photos, old Christmas cards, was empty, or worse, replaced. I turned a corner and stopped. On the wall next to the thermostat, there was a faint rectangle of lighter paint, a shadow of where a picture once hung. I stared at it for a long time. I remembered the photo, me at 8 years old, covered in frosting mid-laugh at my birthday party. That had been the only party they'd thrown me. The year after that, they forgot. No, not forgot. They just didn't mention it until 2 days later, said they were busy, that we'd do something next weekend. But it never came. I used to brush those things off, tell myself they were accidents, misunderstandings, that Rebecca needed more attention because she had more going on. College applications, orchestra competitions, you're more independent. Mum once told me, you don't need as much. I believed her for a while. Now, standing there in that hollow house, looking at the ghost outline of a memory erased, it all felt deliberate. I wandered back into the living room and stared at the wall above the fireplace. A massive black and white canvas photo of Rebecca, taken professionally, hung there like a centerpiece. I tried to imagine what would happen if someone visited this house and didn't know there were 2 daughters. They wouldn't guess. There was nothing left of me here. I sat on the cold leather couch and tried to slow my breathing, but memories rushed in like a tide. The time I got second place in the state piano competition and no one came because Rebecca had a model UN event. The time I asked for a bike for Christmas and got socks while Rebecca got a brand new DSLR. The time I got my first college acceptance letter and Mum said, "That's great, sweetie, but wait till you hear where your sister got in." I had spent years trying to justify those things, rationalize them, but it wasn't until now, sitting in a house that had scrubbed me clean from its walls, that I allowed myself to call it what it was, being erased. In a burst of quiet fury, I stood and walked toward the hallway closet. I pulled it open, half expecting to find more boxes labelled Rebecca's winter clothes or Rebecca's trophies. Instead, I found something else, a box on the top shelf, unlabelled, dusty. I dragged over a chair and pulled it down. Inside were old photo frames wrapped in newspaper. I peeled one back and my breath hitched. It was the frosting photo. Me, 8 years old, laughing. The frame was scratched, but the photo was intact. Behind it were others. School portraits, piano recital. A photo of me and Grandma holding hands on the porch swing. All wrapped, all hidden. I didn't know whether to cry or scream. They hadn't just replaced me, they'd packed me away. Dinner that night was supposed to be a reunion. At least that's what I told myself. A chance to bridge the 3-year canyon to say something real, even if it was awkward. I helped set the table. Plates too clean, silverware placed with military precision. Mum made roasted chicken, the same one she used to make when company came over, not when it was just us. That should have been a clue. We sat in silence for the first few bites. The clink of forks against porcelain filled the space between us. I waited for them to ask about my life, my job, anything, but nothing came. "So, how's Grandma?" I asked, knowing full well they hadn't visited her in weeks. "She's fine," my mother said quickly, brushing her napkin across her lap. "The doctors are keeping her for observation. It's nothing serious," I nodded. "She seemed tired last time I saw her, confused even. She's getting older, that happens," Dad chimed in. "Nothing to worry about." I tried again. She asked about the music room, said she missed the cello. My mother blinked. She shouldn't be stressing about that kind of thing. I let the silence hang for a moment before pushing a little harder. Did she ever mention what she wanted done with her instruments? Another beat of silence. My father cleared his throat. "We'll figure it out when the time comes." "But if she already made a decision," we said, my mother interrupted, "we'll handle it." The finality in her tone shut the door on that topic. I swallowed my frustration with the next bite of dried chicken. "So, where's Rebecca?" I asked, trying to pivot. "She didn't want to be here." "She's traveling," Dad said. "Europe, backpacking with friends." I blinked. "Oh, she didn't mention it when we last texted." "She's been very busy," Mum added, smoothing her placemat like it had offended her. They didn't say when she left, didn't say when she'd be back, just that she was gone, and apparently too busy to care that her grandmother was in the hospital. "She didn't even call Grandma," I asked, frowning. "She sent a card," Dad muttered. "A card for the woman who raised us while they both worked 60-hour weeks. For the woman who taught us how to tie our shoes, bake bread from scratch, and play the first notes on an instrument. A card." I bit the inside of my cheek and turned my attention to my plate. "So, I tried again. About my room. It's being used," Mum said before I could finish. "We told you." "Right," I said slowly. "But what's in there exactly?" "I could help organise if it's fine the way it is," she said more firmly now. The room felt smaller, like the air was being rationed. I looked at my dad, hoping for a softer edge, but he wouldn't meet my eyes. Just kept cutting his food like it was the only thing that mattered. I'd like to see it just for a second." "You're in the guest room now," Mum said, her voice clipped. "Let's leave it at that." A knot formed in my stomach. This wasn't just about boxes or clutter. There was something they weren't saying, something bigger. "You know, it was my room for 18 years, right?" I said, the words coming out before I could filter them. "It's not like I'm asking for much." My mother set her fork down carefully. "Ellie, we're trying to have a peaceful dinner." "Peaceful, right?" I nodded and leaned back in my chair, chewing slowly, tasting nothing. The conversation shifted after that to weather, to lawn maintenance, to some neighbour's dog getting loose. I didn't say much, didn't need to, I wasn't really there anyway. As I watched them speak, animated for the first time all evening, I realised something gutting. I'd been erased so thoroughly. Even my presence at the table felt like a glitch. I wasn't a daughter returning home. I was a ghost sitting in someone else's chair. Later that night, I couldn't sleep. The walls of the guest room pressed in, too sterile, too quiet. I lay there listening to the hum of the refrigerator down the hall, the occasional creak of old pipes, and memories I hadn't invited. My thoughts drifted to Grandma. She was the only person who ever made me feel like I belonged without trying to change me. While my parents called my music a hobby, Grandma called it my voice. She taught me to play the cello in the afternoons after school. Her fingers still graceful despite her age. She didn't rush me, didn't expect brilliance, just presence. When I was 10, she let me touch the family's heirloom violin for the first time. It was wrapped in soft cloth kept in a locked wooden case she stored in her attic studio. "It's older than I am," she said, smiling gently. "And yours someday." That room, her attic sanctuary, was filled with treasures. Gilded flutes, hand-carved mandolins, a harpsichord that creaked when you pressed the keys. But she always said the instruments weren't just things. They held stories, echoes. You had to treat them with reverence. On the night before I left for college, she gave me a key. To the cabinet, she whispered, "For when the time comes, we never told anyone. It wasn't a secret. It was sacred." Years passed, but that bond never dulled. Even after long semesters and missed holidays, I always found my way back to her. She kept a photo of me at her piano, framed in silver, next to the sheet music she annotated in pencil. She never forgot my birthday. She never made me feel small. The last time I saw her before the hospital stay, she looked tired. Her cheeks had hollowed slightly, and her hands shook more than usual, but when she saw me, she smiled in that quiet way that made everything else fall away. We sat on the porch swing, just like always. No music that day, just silence and the warmth of old routine. She reached for my hand and said, "They're fighting me." "About what?" I asked, already knowing. "The instruments," she whispered. "They don't think you deserve them, but I haven't changed my mind." My throat tightened. "You don't have to explain." "I know," she said, "but I want to. You understand them. You don't just play, you listen." That sentence broke something in me. It wasn't about inheritance. It wasn't about possession. It was about being seen. "They said it's selfish," she continued, her voice low, "that I'm favoring you." "You're not," I said, squeezing her hand. "I know," she whispered again, but they didn't take it well. A year earlier, I'd told my parents I planned to help Grandma restore one of the older cellos. I wanted to document its history, maybe write a piece on the craftsmanship. I was excited, stupidly so. They were furious. "You're manipulating her. My father said she's not in her right mind," my mother snapped. I argued back, told them it wasn't about money, that Grandma had the right to choose. That was the night everything shifted. The next morning, my keycard didn't work. I called, thinking it was a mistake. Dad answered and said, "You need time away from all this. We'll talk when things settle." They'd shut me out, literally. I slept in my car that night just outside Grandma Inn's building. She never knew. I didn't want to upset her. When I finally got a new place and a new phone number, I kept contact with her, but less frequently, cautiously. She was getting older, and I didn't want to cause her more stress. But every letter she sent still ended the same way. "Play with heart, and don't let them tell you who you are." Now, in this house where my name wasn't spoken, where my room had been erased, I clung to that memory like a rope. She hadn't forgotten me. She hadn't changed her mind, but everyone else had. The call came just after sunrise. A nurse, soft-spoken and too calm, said Grandma had been admitted during the night. "She's stable," the woman said, but she was very distressed when she arrived, confused, panicked. I was already dressed before the call ended. When I arrived at the hospital, Grandma looked smaller. Her skin was pale, her eyes sunken. But when she saw me, something in her face lifted. Her hand trembled as I took it. "They're gone," she whispered, her voice thin and cracked. "All of them gone?" I asked, sitting beside her. "What's gone?" "The instruments, the whole collection, the cabinet's empty." I blinked. "Wait, what? What do you mean they're gone?" She gripped my hand tighter. "Someone broke in. While I was gone, I came home and everything. It's all missing." My mind scrambled for logic. A break-in, but she lived in a secured building with a coded elevator. The idea that someone could just waltz in, crack open a locked cabinet, and make off with dozens of priceless instruments, it didn't make sense unless they knew exactly what they were looking for. "I called the police," she continued, "but they didn't find any forced entry. Of course they didn't, because there wasn't any." I stayed with her for hours, speaking softly, trying to keep her calm. But her hands wouldn't stop shaking. And when the officer assigned to the case finally arrived, I recognized the expression on his face. Polite doubt. He asked a few questions, nodded, scribbled something in a notepad, and left with a promise to follow up. 2 days later, I overheard my parents talking in the kitchen. "Maybe it was Marta," Mum said, voice hushed. "She has access and she's always dusting around that area." "She wouldn't dare," Dad replied, "but maybe she has a friend." I stood just outside the doorway, out of view, heart pounding. "Mart's been with Grandma for 10 years, Mum added. "She knows those instruments are worth something. Sentimental, sure, but also valuable." "She's not even American," Dad muttered. People get desperate. The ease with which they pinned blame on someone so loyal made me sick. Later that afternoon, I asked point blank, "Do you really think Marta would do this?" Mum hesitated. "We're not saying she did. We're just exploring possibilities." "She's been family," I said flatly. "She took care of Grandma when none of us could." Dad sighed. "Ellie, we're not accusing, but people do things when they think no one's looking." I stared at them, something churning beneath my ribs, and yet there was no sign of a break-in. Neither responded. It wasn't until the end of the week that I overheard the real twist. They were in the study, the door cracked just enough. "Insurance should cover most of it," Dad was saying. "We submitted the claim yesterday." "I told them it was irreplaceable," Mum said, "but they'll still cut a check." "Over 100 grand, right?" he asked. "That's what they estimated based on the last appraisal." I felt like the air had been knocked out of me. They'd already filed the claim before the investigation was closed, before any suspect was identified, before the dust had even settled. I backed away from the door slowly, careful not to make a sound. My stomach turned, my head spun. The instruments weren't just missing, they were part of a transaction. Over the next few days, Grandma's strength faded fast. She no longer sat upright in bed or asked for her music books. Her appetite dwindled to spoonfuls of soup. She spoke less, and when she did, her voice had the flatness of someone who no longer expected to be believed. I sat by her side every afternoon, holding her hand, brushing her hair back from her face, but the spark was dimming. I could feel it. "They were more than just things," she said once. "Barely audible. They were memory, history." I nodded, too choked up to speak. The worst part wasn't the loss of the instruments, it was what the loss meant to her. That someone could take something so sacred and reduce it to a payout. It broke something in her, I could see it, and it lit something in me. Rage, I drove back to the house late one evening, fueled by a gnawing feeling that hadn't let up since overhearing my parents' conversation. Something didn't add up. There had been no forced entry, no fingerprints, no noise, no disruption except for what was missing. If someone had broken in, they'd been surgical, too careful, too quiet. Unless, of course, they didn't have to break in at all. I walked the halls of the house with new eyes. I wasn't just visiting anymore. I was searching, looking, waiting for the house to show me what it had been hiding. And it didn't take long. Near the top of the stairs, just outside my old bedroom door, I noticed something odd. A scratch in the hardwood, faint but fresh. A shallow drag mark like something heavy had been pushed or slid. I knelt down to inspect it closer, definitely new. The varnish hadn't even dulled around it yet. My eyes narrowed on the door, still locked, still forbidden. I stood and walked to the hallway closet, the one I'd opened days ago, to find my childhood photos stashed away. This time I wasn't looking for frames. I was looking for anything out of place. On the top shelf, behind a stack of unused holiday gift bags, I spotted it. A crumpled piece of grey fabric shoved behind a box of wrapping paper. I pulled it down and unfolded it slowly. It was a dust cover, soft, thick, and unmistakably familiar. The kind Grandma used to drape over her instruments when she wasn't playing them. I'd helped fold them hundreds of times growing up. Clean cotton with a distinct faint lavender scent. This one still carried that trace. But now it also held something else. Guilt. I stared at it for a long time. Why would a cloth like this used only in her attic studio be hidden in the hallway closet? Unless someone had moved the instruments, not stolen. Moved. My pulse kicked into overdrive. I searched the rest of the closet, the linen cabinets, the hallway shelves, but found nothing else out of place. Still, it was enough. That scratch on the floor, that cloth. They weren't proof, but they were echoes. Clues. Someone in this house knew more than they were saying. I stepped back and stared again at my old bedroom door. Behind it, something waited. I didn't know what, but I felt it. Heaviness pressing against the other side, daring me to keep asking questions. I wasn't ready to open it. Not yet. But for the first time since coming back, I felt something other than numbness, determination. No more letting them control the narrative, no more swallowing the lies. If they thought I was going to disappear quietly like before, they didn't know me at all. I couldn't sleep that night. My mind kept circling, chasing shadows and half-formed theories. The scratch on the floor, the dust cover, the silence. It all pointed to one thing, and yet I needed more than a gut feeling. I needed truth, something I could see, touch feel right beneath my fingers. Around 2:13 a.m. I got out of bed. I didn't bother turning on the light. The house was silent, heavy, with that deep kind of nighttime stillness that makes every step sound louder. I moved down the hallway barefoot, careful not to make the floorboards creak. Behind the laundry shelf in the mudroom was an old panel. It had been there forever, a warped piece of plywood no one ever bothered to replace. Behind it, tucked between the studs, was a ledge barely big enough for a roll of tape. That's where we used to hide the spare keys. A childhood secret turned family habit. I reached in, it was still there. A new key, brighter metal, barely worn, taped exactly where I remembered. I stood in front of my old door with the key pinched between my fingers. My heart beat hard against my ribs, but I didn't hesitate. The lock turned with a soft click. The smell hit me first. Dust, stale air, and something else, like the inside of a suitcase that hadn't been opened in years. I pushed the door open slowly, letting the faint hallway light stretch across the room. It was nothing like I remembered. My posters were gone, the bookshelf empty, the furniture pushed to the sides, covered in white sheets. Boxes were stacked haphazardly in the corner, and near the window something long and rectangular sat under a tarp. I stepped inside. The air was colder in here, like the vents had been shut off on purpose. I walked across the room slowly, each step stirring dust from the carpet. When I pulled back the tarp, my breath caught. There they were. Cases, so many of them. The cello with the worn leather strap, the violin in its soft green-lined cradle, the polished wood of the dulcimer gleaming faintly beneath a thin layer of grime. I reached out, fingertips brushing the edge of the mandolin case, and everything inside me went still. They hadn't been stolen. They'd been hidden. I opened one case, then another. Everything was there, intact, untouched. And then, in the back corner, I saw a shoebox. An ordinary cardboard box marked with a faint E on the side. I lifted the lid. Letters, dozens of them, folded, yellowed slightly, tied in bundles with thin ribbon, my name on every envelope. I pulled one out, heart pounding, and unfolded it. Ellie, I hope you're eating enough. I left cookies with Marta for you. They're your favourite. Love, Grandma. I opened another. Ellie, your concert was beautiful. I'm so proud of you. Keep playing with heart. And another. Ellie, I know they don't always see you, but I do. I always will. My throat burned, my vision blurred. These weren't forgotten letters. They were intercepted, hidden like the instruments like me. I sank to the floor, letters in my lap, hands trembling. The lies weren't just recent. They went back years. How many times had she written to me, waiting for a response that never came? How many times had I sat in my apartment wondering why the silence stretched so wide? They kept everything from me, the music, the words, the love, all because it didn't serve their story. I don't remember standing up. I don't remember how the box ended up back on the floor or how the lid got closed. All I know is that 1 second I was on my knees, gripping letters from the only person who ever really saw me, and the next I was back in the hallway, phone in hand, calling 911. My fingers were numb from more than just the cold. The dispatcher answered with a steady voice. I gave my name, the address, and a sentence I never thought I'd say. I need to report hidden property that was part of a fraudulent theft claim. There was a pause on the line. I filled it with facts. My grandmother's hospitalization, the alleged break-in, the insurance claim, the discovery. My voice was calm, too calm, like I was reading from a script I hadn't realized I'd memorized. Officers are on their way. The dispatcher said, "Are you safe?" "Safe?" I glanced back toward the hallway. The door to my room was still open. A sliver of yellow light spilled across the hardwood, cutting into the dark. "I'm outside," I said. "I'm not going back in." I walked barefoot onto the front porch, not caring about the temperature. The air hit me like a slap, sharp, wet, cold. I wrapped my arms around myself and stared out at the quiet street. The porch light buzzed above me. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked once and stopped. It was the kind of stillness that made you forget the world kept moving. I didn't look back. I couldn't. The betrayal was too fresh, too deep. This wasn't just theft. This was premeditated erasure, a calculated decision to not only strip Grandma of her legacy, but to make sure I never even knew it existed. Letters, instruments, memories, all tucked away like clutter in a closet, like I was a mistake they were embarrassed to acknowledge. Every breath I took felt thin, like I was inhaling frost. Headlights appeared at the end of the block 27 minutes later. I counted everyone. When the patrol car finally pulled into the driveway, I didn't move, just stood there like part of the porch, barely able to feel my legs. 2 officers stepped out, a man and a woman. They approached slowly, their expressions unreadable. "You the one who called?" the woman asked gently. I nodded. "Can you walk us through it?" So I did again. This time outside in the cold while the porch light flickered above us like it too was tired of pretending. I told them everything what I had found, what I knew, what I suspected. I didn't try to explain away my parents' motives. I didn't soften any words. After I finished, the male officer asked, "You said the items were stored in a locked room?" "Yes," I said, "but they used to be mine, or at least hers, my grandmother's." He nodded, then asked to see the room. I led them inside without a word. The house was still dark, still quiet. I walked them up the stairs, past the scratch in the floor, and opened the door fully. The officers entered, flashlights sweeping across the cases, the dust, the long-forgotten truth. They didn't speak for a long time. Then the woman crouched near the cello and pointed. "This strap, there's a fresh crease." I stepped closer. She was right. The leather was worn, yes, but not consistently. There were pressure lines along the side like it had been buckled tightly into something recently. She moved the violin case, lifted the corner gently. Underneath faint smudges, dirt, maybe dried grass. Out of place in this tightly sealed room, the man nodded. These were moved. Recently, she agreed, then brought back. I felt my stomach drop. So they hadn't just planned to sell them, they tried. The instruments had been transported, maybe shown to someone, maybe priced, maybe even negotiated. But for some reason, timing, second thoughts, fear, they were returned carefully, quietly, and sealed away. The fraud wasn't theoretical anymore. It was real. "Do you want to press charges?" the male officer asked softly. I didn't answer right away. I just stared at the room, at the walls I used to know, at the dust that covered everything except the guilt. Then I said, "Yes," he nodded. "We'll take a formal statement and we'll need to secure the property for evidence." I followed them back downstairs, hands still trembling. They asked me where I was staying. "I don't know," I said honestly. "Just not here. Do you want someone to stay with you tonight?" I shook my head. They offered me a ride. I took it. And as the patrol car pulled away, I didn't glance back at the house. There was nothing left to see. The next morning came grey and muted. I hadn't slept, only drifted in and out of a haze while curled up on a stiff bench in the hospital waiting room. The officer who'd driven me the night before had promised someone would follow up. He hadn't been lying. By mid-morning, 2 more officers arrived at the house, this time with a clipboard, a body camera, and a search warrant. I wasn't there to see it, but they told me everything later. My parents answered the door, still in pajamas. Confusion painted across their faces. Mum tried to smile, said something about misunderstanding, and surely there's been a mistake. They let the officers in. They had no choice. The search began upstairs, starting with my old bedroom. Photos were taken. Cataloguing was done. The officers opened each instrument case, documented condition, make, serial numbers. Each piece was treated with care, like it was finally being seen for what it truly was: irreplaceable, personal, and stolen. When the officers moved to the master bedroom, things changed. At first, Dad acted casual. You're welcome to look anywhere. There's nothing to hide. But when they opened the second drawer in his desk, silence filled the room. There, neatly organized in a blue file folder, were documents from the insurance company, letters, signed forms, appraisal sheets, a printed copy of the claim. One page in particular had a bold figure at the top on of 3800 dial. That's what the instruments were worth on paper. The claim had been processed and approved, the payout scheduled for next week. The check had already been cut. One of the officers glanced up. "Can you explain this?" My mother stood behind Dad, her arms crossed tightly. Her face had lost all pretense. Gone was the practiced smile, the pleasant hosting mask. "This was a precaution," she said quietly, "in case we couldn't locate the items." "You filed this before searching the house?" the officer asked. "We assumed they were gone," Dad offered. "We were told by who?" "They said nothing because there was no who. There was just them caught." The camera on the officer's vest blinked red. "We're going to need to take this with us," he said, gently lifting the folder. "We'll add it to the report." Neither of them stopped him, neither protested, but they also didn't apologize, not once. Later, I returned with an officer to collect my things. My suitcase had already been packed, placed by the front door, like they knew I wouldn't be coming back. My parents stood nearby. They didn't speak, didn't meet my eyes. I wanted them to scream, to plead, to cry, but instead they were cute. Still, I realized then that the idea of family I'd held onto through every forgotten birthday, every quiet dinner, every erased photograph had been mine alone. A one-sided story I kept rewriting so it wouldn't hurt. Now the story had ended. No final chapter, no closure, just silence. I asked one of the officers if he could walk me inside while I got my things. It wasn't that I felt unsafe. Not exactly. It was something more subtle, like standing too close to a fire you've already been burned by. I just didn't want to be alone in that space again, not even for a moment. "Of course," he said, "take your time." My suitcase sat neatly by the door as if someone had placed it there ceremonially. It was the same one I'd wheeled in just a few days ago, full of hope I hadn't admitted to having. Hope that maybe things would be different this time. I stepped past it and moved toward the guest room, where I'd left a few small things, a book, a charger, my earrings. My mother stood silently in the hallway, arms crossed like a gatekeeper. She didn't say anything as I passed, neither did I. The air inside the room felt heavier now, like even the dust carried judgment. I gathered my things quickly, stuffing them into the side pocket of the suitcase, then paused. A blinking light on the old answering machine caught my eye. I didn't know they still used it. It sat on a small corner table near the staircase, wedged between a decorative bowl of keys and a stack of unopened mail. I stepped closer and saw the tiny red number. One unheard message. The screen was dusty, but the date on the message was clear. 3 months ago, I glanced behind me. My parents were still by the front entrance, quietly watching. The officer lingered nearby, giving me space, but present enough to intervene if anything escalated. I pressed play, a soft beep, then her voice. "Hi, it's me. I'm not sure if Ellie's still in town, but I've been thinking about her a lot. I wrote her again last week, but I'm worried she didn't get it. If she's there, please tell her I miss her and that the cello is hers, always was. No matter what anyone says, I hope she's still playing. She was always meant to." A long pause followed, then more quietly, "I know she might not believe it, but I never stopped waiting. I hope she knows that. Goodbye." The message ended with a mechanical click, nothing more. My breath caught somewhere between my throat and my chest. My fingers hovered above the machine, unsure of what to do next. It was all there. Her love, her certainty, her pain. Everything I'd needed to hear, everything I'd never been allowed to hear. They hadn't deleted it, they just never gave it to me. I didn't turn around, didn't ask why. There was no answer that would matter. I deleted the message and walked away. Not because I wanted to erase her voice, but because I couldn't bear the thought of them hearing it again. It didn't belong to them, it belonged to me, Back at the door, the officer reached for my suitcase. "You ready?" I nodded. My mother opened her mouth, then closed it again. My father stood stiffly, eyes unfocused. Neither offered a word. Not an apology, not even a goodbye. Perfect. I didn't need closure from people who built a life on silence. I stepped outside into the cold, the door clicking shut behind me. The air was sharp, but I welcomed it. For the first time in days, I could breathe. In the car, I stared straight ahead as the officer drove me away from the house that raised me, the people who failed me, and the version of myself that kept hoping they'd change. I felt nothing. No sadness, no rage, no victory, just emptiness. The kind that settles in your chest when something final happens. The kind that tells you, this is it. You're done. And I was. By the time I reached the hospital, dawn had fully broken, casting the sky in soft pastels. I walked the familiar hallway toward her room, the scent of antiseptic and the faint beeping of machines forming the quiet background to my thoughts. She was awake when I arrived, propped slightly against her pillows, her eyes flicked toward me the second I stepped inside. We didn't speak right away. I just sat down beside her and took her hand. It felt thinner than I remembered, more fragile, but still warm. "I found them," I said softly. Her eyes didn't widen. She didn't gasp. She just blinked slowly, as though she'd already known and was waiting for me to say it out loud. "The instruments," I continued. "They're safe now." Still, she said nothing. Her lips trembled slightly, her fingers tightening ever so gently around mine. "I didn't want to upset you," I said, "but I thought you should know." I left out the rest. The betrayal, the lies, the room, the letter, the message, the cold eyes of people who used to be my parents. I gave her only the headline that what mattered was no longer lost. A single tear slid from the corner of her eye. She didn't brush it away. "I was so scared," she whispered finally, "not of dying, but of leaving without passing it on." "You didn't," I said, squeezing her hand. "It's still yours. It always was." A long pause then, her voice barely audible. "Did they fight you?" I hesitated, not because I didn't want to answer, but because I didn't want to hurt her. She watched my face carefully, reading between the silence. Then she smiled, not sadly, not in defeat, but with something else entirely. "Gratitude. Thank you," she said, voice, for not choosing silence. My chest ached. "You knew. I'm old, Ellie," she replied, eyes glinting. "Not stupid." She turned her head slightly, looking toward the window where the morning sun poured in. "I knew they didn't approve. I knew they wouldn't tell you, but I hoped you'd find your way back to it anyway." "I almost didn't," I admitted, "but you did." That was all she said, and it was enough. For the next few minutes, we didn't talk. We just sat there, her hand in mine, while the light shifted slowly across the room. She closed her eyes and exhaled, not in exhaustion, but in peace. For the first time in weeks, the tension had left her shoulders. I glanced around her hospital room, impersonal walls, beige curtains, the TV mounted high in the corner, playing muted weather updates. A place built for function, not comfort. But here, in this small, sterile space, something warm pulsed between us, unspoken, resilient, love, legacy, music. She turned to me again and said, "Will you play again?" I opened my mouth, then closed it. Hadn't touched a bow in over a year. The last time I did, it felt hollow, like the sound came from someone else's hands. But now, "Yeah," I said, "I think I will." Her smile deepened. "I'd like to hear you again soon." "You will." That promise lingered between us like a final note. Before I left, she gripped my wrist gently. "Not everything has to be forgiven to be let go," she whispered. "Don't confuse the two." I nodded. I didn't fully understand it yet, but I knew I would. Eventually, by the time I stepped outside the hospital, my phone had already begun to vibrate. First once, then again and again. I didn't look right away. I sat on the bench outside the front entrance and let the sunlight warm my face. For a moment, I pretended it was just a beautiful day, that my life wasn't unraveling and reforming all at once. Then the phone buzzed again, longer this time. I finally looked. Mum, 4 missed calls. Dad, 6, Rebecca, 2, and then the texts. We need to talk. How could you do this to us? You embarrassed the family. Your grandmother is fine. Stop being dramatic. This isn't what family does. Answer the phone. I didn't. Not until Rebecca called again. I hesitated, then answered. Her voice was calm, measured, practiced. I heard what you did, she said. You mean what they did? I replied. They're devastated, Ellie. You could have talked to them. You didn't have to call the cops. They filed a false insurance claim. They tried to erase Grandma's legacy. What exactly should I have done? She went quiet for a moment. Then it wasn't that simple, isn't it? I knew about the instruments, she admitted softly. My stomach turned. You knew? I didn't know they were going to claim them as stolen, she said quickly. I just knew they were trying to move them quietly. Why didn't you say anything? Because I have plans, Ellie. I have an entire semester abroad coming up. I couldn't afford to get in the middle of it. Her voice trembled slightly. If I had spoken up, they would have pulled support. Everything I've worked for gone, so you stayed quiet. I had to. I didn't respond right away. I stared at the sidewalk, at the way the cracks split and veined like roots under my feet. I've spent my entire life being the one they forgot, I said quietly. And when it finally mattered, when Grandma needed someone, you chose yourself. I didn't mean to hurt anyone, but you did, she exhaled, then added, you always make things bigger than they are. Always the martyr. That did it. I hung up, blocked her number. Then I opened my messages, blocked Mum, Dad, deleted every voicemail, cleared every log. I didn't need to hear another excuse, another twisted version of what they thought family meant. I walked back inside the hospital. An hour later, I signed temporary housing paperwork to stay nearby. It wasn't fancy, just a small studio a few blocks from Grandma's rehab centre, but it was mine. The next day, I packed up what little I had and moved in. Grandma smiled when I told her. You're staying? She asked. Yeah, I said, for a while. She didn't ask questions, just nodded. In the following weeks, I got into a rhythm. I cooked for her, read to her, sat by her window while she napped. I cleaned the instruments one by one, polishing wood and tuning strings. The cello's bow creaked when I first picked it up. My fingers felt stiff, rusty. But one night, as the sun dipped below the hills, I sat on the edge of Grandma's bed and played. Just a few notes, low, steady, familiar. She closed her eyes and whispered, There she is. And I smiled. For the first time in years, I felt full. Not because I had all the answers, not because everything was fixed, but because I had chosen truth over convenience, love over blood, music over silence. And somehow that was enough. 6 months passed in a rhythm of healing. Day by day, the weight of what happened became less of a wound and more of a scar. One that still ached in the quiet, but no longer dictated every breath. Grandma recovered better than anyone expected. Oh no. The doctors said her strength was unusual for someone her age, but I wasn't surprised. She had always been made of something stronger than the rest of us. Music, memory, maybe magic. And today she turned 90. The party wasn't extravagant, just a modest gathering at the community centre near her building. Some of her closest friends came, old neighbours, former students, even Marta, the caregiver my parents once tried to blame. She brought flowers and tears in equal measure. We didn't send invites to my parents or Rebecca, we didn't need to. Inside the event room, the air was warm with laughter and soft background music. Finger foods lined the tables, and a small cake with the number 90 stood proudly in the centre, its candles waiting. In one corner of the room, set beneath a soft spotlight, were the instruments. All of them. The cello, the violin, the douloumet, even the old flute with the cracked mouthpiece, cleaned, restored, arranged with care on velvet-draped tables, like honoured guests of their own. Nobody touched them. People approached, admired, spoke in hushed tones about their beauty, their history, but no one dared pick one up. It was an unspoken rule. Those instruments had already survived too much to be handled casually. Grandma sat near the center of the room wearing her favorite cardigan, the one with the pearl buttons and a brooch in the shape of a treble cleft. Her hair was pulled back neatly, her hands folded in her lap, but her eyes sparkled like they were 20 again. She spoke with guests, sipped her tea, and laughed more than I'd seen her laugh in years. Genuine laughter from the belly, not the throat. As the afternoon wore on, the chatter settled into a comfortable murmur. The light outside softened, casting long shadows through the windows. Then, without saying a word, Grandma stood. Conversations paused. She moved slowly but confidently toward the corner of the room, toward the piano. It was an old upright one brought in just for the occasion, tuned, cleaned, waiting. I watched her step up to it, rest her fingers on the worn ivory keys, and exhale slowly. No one breathed. Then she began to play. A familiar melody, one I hadn't heard since I was a child. It was slow, deliberate, the kind of song that carries entire lifetimes in its pauses. Her fingers trembled slightly, but the notes were clear, full. The room fell completely silent. People stopped mid-sentence, mid-sip, eyes turned, hands stilled. And as the music whipped its way through the air, something inside all of us shifted. Because this wasn't just music. It was memory. It was legacy. It was defiance. Every note said, "I'm still here." Every phrase whispered, "You didn't break me." By the time she finished, I had tears running silently down my face. So did Marta. So did half the room. Grandma turned from the piano, took a shallow bow, and said with a grin, "Not bad for 90. Laughter burst through the room like sunlight. But I didn't laugh. I just smiled. Because in that moment, surrounded by instruments that had once been nearly lost, standing beside the woman who'd never stopped believing in me, I felt whole. And for the first time in a long time, that was enough. 3 months after the party, the verdict came. My parents plead guilty. No drawn-out trial, no dramatic cross-examinations, just a quiet appearance before a judge flanked by lawyers where they admitted to filing a false insurance claim and obstructing the investigation. The courtroom was small, sterile, and mostly empty. No reporters, no family. They were sentenced to 1 year of house arrest, 400 hours of community service, and a permanent mark on their record as felons. Insurance fraud. The phrase followed them like a stain, showing up in every background check, every neighborhood whisper. They wore ankle monitors now. Couldn't leave their house except for court-approved labor shifts, trash collection, food, bank assistance, city park cleanups. Mum stopped volunteering at her church group. Dad resigned from his company before they could fire him. Neighbors who once waved now crossed the street. As for Rebecca, she disappeared, deleted all her social media accounts within a week of the sentencing. One day she was posting about cappuccinos in Copenhagen. The next day, nothing. Word got around that her scholarship was revoked, her name pulled from the honours list, her travel plans cancelled indefinitely. She didn't call me again, I didn't expect her to, and I didn't miss it. I didn't watch the news, didn't read the court transcripts. I already knew the story, I'd lived it. Instead, I focused on what came next. Grandma and I moved into a small craftsman-style house just outside town. It had a garden she tended from her wheelchair and a front porch with perfect acoustics. We kept the instruments in the parlor, arranged in the same order they'd always been in her attic. Each morning, I made her tea, opened the windows, and played. Sometimes it was the cello, slow and solemn. Sometimes it was the mandolin, light and playful. Sometimes we played together, she on the keys, me on strings like we used to when I was 10, before I knew what it felt like to be forgotten. There were no more secrets, no locked doors, no hushed tones behind walls, just music, just presence. Some days were hard. She tired easily. Her bones ached more, but her mind, sharp as ever, guided us through. She told stories I'd never heard before, about her youth, about love lost and found, about the first time she played in front of a crowd and forgot every note. We laughed a lot, more than I thought possible. We cried too, but only sometimes, only when it mattered. She never asked about my parents, never mentioned their names, and I didn't either. Not because I was bitter, but because they no longer lived in the part of my heart that counted.
One morning, I walked into the parlor to find her asleep in her chair, a blanket draped over her knees, the sheet music from Chopin still resting in her lap. I didn't wake her. I just sat beside her and waited, listening to the sound of her steady breath. That was our new rhythm. That was enough. The past hadn't vanished. It still echoed now and then in songs I used to play, in pictures tucked away in drawers, but it didn't control me anymore. I wasn't trying to fix what had broken. I was simply choosing what to hold on to. And every time I looked at her, at the woman who gave me music, who saw me, who never let the silence win, I felt sure of who I was. Not their daughter, not anymore, but the person Grandma always believed I could be. And that was